Welcome to the final workshop from this series of workshops of the PADE project. Today we are talking about digital business tools, amongst, I'm sure, many other topics and many other things that will come up as we do dive into things. So with that, I'll pass it on to Inga. Take it away.
All right. Well, as usual, I'm joining you from Yukon, Whitehorse, on the traditional territories of the Kwantlen First Nation and Town Quechan Council. Those are self-governing nations, and I'm forever grateful that I finally made it up here, having lived in many other parts of the country, typically on unceded and unsurrendered territory. It's a very different vibe up here. So this is the last of a series of 12 workshops. We started back in the fall around really fundamentals of what it is to have a web presence, looking at assessments, web content, social media content, what works, what doesn't work, how do you actually engage, what do we mean by that, and what kind of content actually achieves that. And we spent some time looking at, what Google services are. We're interested in Google typically because it is the big one. 90% of search happens on it. They also own YouTube and a bunch of other services, right? So Google tends to be really important. From there, we moved into sort of beyond fundamentals around advanced search engine optimization and open link data. So this is about the bigger playing field that the word we hear around that is discoverability. How can people stumble upon you when they're looking for adjacent things or similar things? And that's where all of that advanced search engine optimization centered around machine readable data comes in. So schema.org, making sure that you code your content in a particular way so that the world, search engines to start with, but then the world can actually find you. This current series has been all around digital business models and digital revenue streams. So that is qualitatively a different animal, because now we're taking basically your bricks and mortar experiences, and we're figuring out whether there is a digital play with those, not just to market the bricks and mortar experience, not just to get people to come out to your festival events in the real world, in the flesh and blood, right? But to figure out what is the adjacent piece to that. And we had talked in the last couple of sessions about the fact that it's very rare to find a bricks and mortar organization that has succeeded in the digital world, right? So it's not Chapters that's the biggest bookseller online, it's Amazon, right? A native digital organization. It's not music labels that figured out streaming music, it's iTunes and Spotify, computer companies, right? People who are not in the sector, but who have managed to take a tremendous amount of revenue from the sector, like to the tune of 98%, 99%, right? Has huge impacts on the artists. Because, as we know, when we're looking down the chain, the people that always get devalued in this digital world are the content creators. Incredibly challenging to deal with. And we've seen that in all other disciplines. So the only reason, you may remember my supposition why it is that some of those, sort of more three-dimensional art forms like theater and dance haven't quite been digitized, right? While music has. It's just a lot harder to do that and generate a similar enough experience. But as the internet changes, right, we really need to pay attention. So we're again in that scenario where you're going to be dealing with a lot of adjacent industries. Let's say virtual reality. Let's say video gaming. Like those are not things that we would have thought of natively, so to speak, as being part of the performing arts or the life arts. But in the digital realm, those skill sets really come to bear, right? So I just wanted to sort of say that as a sort of an introductory notion. I'm going to share my screen a little bit today, a little bit more than I might ordinarily, just because I think it'll help us follow the conversation a little bit. The other day we had this question about, this digital disruption thing poses a really big question. And the question is, what should a Canadian digital performing arts ecosystem look like? And We still got to generate revenue. So how is it that that we can generate revenue, and how is that revenue shared in the digital world? My personal opinion is that the way it's been done so far is incredibly problematic, and we need to find ways to fix it. The problem with fixing it is that you need to, as a sector, we need to figure out the technology aspect of that. And because you're arts organizations, first and foremost, you're not tech companies, right? It's been actually quite difficult. So what I want to spend a little bit of time on today is to help us unpack what's been happening in the last few years in the digital space, that maybe you can either ride on and leverage, or that might inspire you to want to take a bigger role in that arena. There's been four main elements. There is a number of projects that are all about data strategies. So this is more like the stuff that we were talking about when we talked about advanced SEO, advanced search engine optimization, and discoverability. And there's some quite advanced projects that I want to make sure you're just kind of aware of. There's also been some work around the art services side. So this project is one of those, right? It's about digital know-how. It's about digital intelligence and literacy, being able to even have the conversation around business models, right? And then there's some projects around equity, diversity, and inclusion. So as you might imagine, we have a choice, right? We can either replicate the physical world in which we've been living, and we know that equity doesn't exist in that world. Whether it's Black Lives Matters, whether it's disability arts, whether it's our relationship to Indigenous people in this country, the gaps are vast. So we have a choice to make about whether we simply replicate those problems in the digital world, or whether we start to make decisions that actually make things better. So there's a few pieces that people have been working on around trying to figure that out. Most of what I want to talk to you about today is the business to consumer pieces. So, getting your product to market. There are also a few back-end tools, business to business collaborative tools that I think are worth mentioning. So I've got a, quick reference to those. So as far as a survey goes of what these things are, this project, as I say, is a huge part of that. There's two others that you may be aware of. One was Making Tomorrow Better. That project is over now. I led it for 3 years. But like you are thinking about what's the repository in the future for this work, that site continues to be up and running. We're maintaining it. The Atlantic Percentage Association is, continuing to invest sort of at that basic level, and I'll be continuing to add content. There was a really interesting project out on Vancouver Island, the Dig Arts project. There is a number of reports that if you haven't seen them yet, you might want to look at. They deal a lot with the digital infrastructure backbone that you do within your offices. So that's like another layer to all of that, right? Which is how do I work with my colleagues, and how effective or not is that? And can I simplify some of those pieces around, the office collaboration or collaborating with partners? One of the things they found is that, by the time they added it up, organizations like yourself might have about 100 different digital tools you're using. And it starts with your email and the Slack channels, and you use Google Drive, but you also use Dropbox, but there's a lot of proliferation of similar things and like things. So they started to really take that apart and try to help people understand how they might streamline their office operations. So those are basically, digital know-how, information libraries of content that are really worth maintaining. I think all of those are going to be living repositories. As this project does more interesting work, you might find ways to add to your library as well. But I wanted to sort of say that in terms of the cross-referencing piece. Now, one of the things that we know around the data strategy side, and like I say, that's all about discoverability, really. Like, do you even get to play online anymore? Or are other sectors, other sites, simply usurping the space the mental space people have when they do searches, because you're not implementing some of those current standards, right? The big players here are basically Google, schema.org, which is a partnership of search engines, W3C, which is this not-for-profit thing that governs the internet, Wikimedia. We talked a lot about the Wikidata side of that in terms of linked open data, but Wikimedia includes Wikipedia and a bunch of other wikis. So they're also a nonprofit, also US based, but actually super important and super large. When you're looking at these big players, you can quickly see how Canadian puppetry isn't going to figure in that world unless we make it so. Right? Like, it's our effort that will make the difference there. So there's a few Canadian initiatives that are about feeding those bigger engines, data sets that allow us to play. I mean, even in general terms, the Canadian performing arts sector doesn't really have a play in that big boy, big whatever world, right? So Culture Creates, and one of their projects, that's artsdata.ca, is actually predicated on that. So if today here's the actionable item for you. If today you are using structured data for your events, you're using schema.org, JSON-LD markup, drop an email to artsdata.ca. Their email address is on their website, and just say, hey, can you start including us in your data set? And what they will do is they will include you on the list of websites that they crawl regularly. And your content will magically become part of that data set, right? The entire, all you need to have is JSON-LD markup. Tammy Lee, who runs that organization, will be most likely the one that you speak with. She's lovely. And what they basically have been about doing is to generate that sense of, if we own the data that we have in the arts sector as an arts sector, then we can actually start to build some really useful services on top of that for our audiences. So this is still early stuff. The first step is always to develop what they call a knowledge graph. That's a Google term, by the way, which is basically just a complex database. So this is actually quite an important initiative that comes out of Montreal. Two others that are really interesting. If you haven't paid attention, you might want to. And some of the work we've done over the last few weeks, use this knowledge or this similar information. One of them was the Linked Digital Futures work that the Canadian Arts Presenting Association has spearheaded. They ended up doing a lot of work around Wikidata. So when we did the Wikidata workshops, I kind of leveraged some of their stuff and tried to make it even more intelligible, more usable, more implementable. That Performing Arts Genome Project is one that is tackling the W3C world, where they've created a project that is trying to bring visibility by making sure that there's the correct nomenclature and taxonomy, so what we call things and how we describe it, relative to the performing arts. One of the challenges is, if the categories don't exist within those worlds, right, we're not going to be able to leverage what those worlds in terms of W3C and Google and Schema actually offer. So we have to tell them how we want our art sectors to be described. We have to tell them what is important. So this Performing Arts Genome is literally doing that. And they've developed a W3C working group around it. So again, these are really backbone pieces, right? For most arts organizations, your actionable item around that is, you're not going to become a technologist, right? You're not going to become that kind of a data expert. But those are some of these enabling projects that exist. And as we all come back to the real world in physical meeting, these will become, much more important, much more rapidly again. They weren't unimportant during COVID, but they certainly had more time to try to figure it out, right? Most of us are going to be really thriving on the online, not on the online world, but in the physical realm, putting on festivals and events and those type of things. Now, super briefly, Arts Pond out of Toronto is an organization that has tried to tackle many different dimensions of precarious life in the arts. So the digital projects are these three. Digital ASO really was looking at sort of equity, diversity, and inclusion and what that takes. They've also had a couple of projects where they've been trying to develop software, primarily targeting smaller creators and producers across a bunch of disciplines, including the performing arts, but also visual arts. So Open Hatch Open and Artsy United are those two. So I wanted to give you a quick reference to that. I meant to touch base with Jessa Agalo, who runs all of this, to out of Toronto, to figure out how easy it, like, is there a downloadable thing yet? Can you just download, you know, an app or a application? I actually don't know the answer to that, but I'm pretty sure she's a sharing and caring kind of an approach that she's taken to all of that work. So it's just an email away to figure out, you know, where they're at and how usable it is. One of the things that she did through Hatch Open is some of you might be needing to report to PADE, that database that tries to, you know, figure out where all the public money is going and stuff, and it's pretty painful to use, and the categories aren't necessarily at all making any sense whatsoever to you. So one of the things that she's developed as part of Hatch Open is a mapping of all the financial categories that is actually relevant to producers and creators. So it's worth looking at. Another thing that you may or may not be aware of at all is there is this thing called AMS Network, created by FAVA, the Film and Video Arts Society in Alberta. So they're an art service organization, member base, coming out of film and video. They spent the last 10 years developing basically a software application that allows them to manage membership and a bunch of membership services. So for some organizations that deal with members or a lot of partners would be the same thing. It's a common platform that you can use to manage all kinds of bits and pieces of the backend business. Includes an invoicing module, includes a little bit of project management, workflow pieces. So that for some of you might be interesting to take a look at. They've received a lot of funding through the Digital Strategy Fund as well in the last few years. So they predate that as an idea by about 6 or 7 years, but they were supported publicly as well. And they essentially run this as a co-op. So the idea being that, you know, they don't need to make money at having that thing necessarily. Like, it's not a for-profit motive. It's a co-op that is allowing a bunch of other organizations that essentially, like, membership based, often ends up running as a co-op like organization anyways, right? That's really where their sweet spot is.
Inga, just to, sorry to interrupt, can you just repeat who was doing the PADE info breakdown assistance program?
Hatch Open. So that's part of ArtsPond. And you can reach Jessa at hello@artspond.com. Or Jessa@artspond.com works too. And I know that recently she had posted a thing where she's actually made public that mapping. And I think she might have still been asking for feedback on it. It's been sort of a, you know, a couple of years effort, as you might imagine. If you use that thing, you know how unwieldy it is. Yeah. So again, it's like a backbone of your business kind of a thing, right? Trying to make sense of this unwieldy amount of data you've got. Then on the business to business side, there's sort of three things that you might pay attention to. Now, they all relate to the way, two of them relate to the way that these regional presenting networks, which are marketplaces, like Atlantic Presenters Association, like Ontario Presents, Manitoba Arts Network, they're in every region in the country except for the north. Showcasing is their lifeblood. So showcasing is about bringing artists in front of presenters in order to block book tours. Simple as that. They developed, that group of organizations a number of years ago developed a thing called I Want to Showcase. It's basically just an application form. And in part that's designed to, it's web-based, so in part it helps us not to have to re-enter the same information a million times when you're just going to showcase in different events. You can almost do it as a one application serving a number of these organizations. It hasn't had a lot of development in the last few years, but it's just, it's just an application form that tries to simplify one aspect of if you were to get into showcasing. Now, I should tell you that, theater or theater-like things rarely get showcased in these regional presenting network shows, because you tend to be much more expensive than a singer-songwriter with a guitar or even a piano. Most theaters have pianos, right, that they can haul out. So there has been a real disadvantage to dance, to theater. There's very little of that touring across the country, as you know. Which, we can decide whether that's problematic or not. It's simply a fact, and there's a bunch of things that drive that. One of the things that drives it is not just the expense of mounting shows in different places as opposed to, remounting them, like creating your own version of it. But it's also simply, there's been very little exposure of available product, so to speak, available shows to presenters in different regions of the country. So the market access piece has been a huge problem. So the Pitch.ca, you may know that I'm project managing that starting back in 2019. The Pitch.ca is actually predicated on developing a digital marketplace showcasing for the performing arts that brings all of those buyers and sellers together, just like we would in the real world, but it does it without the challenge of having to mount it physically. So you're not getting a 15-minute, experience of a theater piece. It's really hard to buy that for anyone. They want to see the whole thing, right? But instead, you can actually showcase the entire thing. And we're able to bring together in the digital space buyers and sellers. So a lot of the cost drivers fall away. That's the idea, anyways. Similarly, if you're coming from, going from Newfoundland to, a showcase in BC is really expensive. Going from Nunavut to a showcase in Ottawa is actually sometimes when you're scheduling events, festivals, you're going to be looking for product too, right? So some of you wear both hats, of course, as being both a producer and a presenter. And then there's another adjunct to that world, which is a block booking tool. I don't know that it has a name yet, so I've just maintained sort of the use of block booking tool. That's really and because it used to be an incredibly manual process, so there's now a tool that tries to digitize some of that and make it a little bit easier. Again, a lot of that is predicated on trying to minimize, repeated data entry of the same pieces of information. Right? It gets pretty tedious. We waste a ton of time doing that. I'm not certain whether they're intending to make that available in a broader way. There's some clients I work with that have a real interest in some of the things that are embedded in a tool like that, like scheduling, being able to distribute that to all of the venues that are involved in the tour and things of that nature, right? I'm not sure whether these people are actually intending to make that a broader thing, but I do know that a client of mine is, we're about to write one of those digital strategy fund proposals. So we're in this ideation stage right now with Home Roots, which essentially does that. They put on, a number of tours a year in the physical world. They have a bunch of venues and a bunch of, sort of set tours across the country normally. So they have a lot of similar needs, but also some additional needs. So we're looking at building a tool that would do a lot of that, and that would help, automate and sort of stitch together the entire process, from booking and getting people to, different hosts and houses. This is often predicated on either community venues or it's house concerts, right? So we're not necessarily promoting venues in this case, right? So there's a bunch of different layers that are a little bit different from the, run-of-the-mill theater world. So all to say, when Mercado disappeared early in during COVID, which was a tool for festivals that actually did some of these things reasonably, there's a real gap that emerged. So that's one project that I'm happen to be working with, trying to alleviate some of that. So that's to give you a bit of an idea. So there's quite a bit of activity, right? And there's different sort of pieces around the backbone and the data side of that and the actual tool side of that, that I think you just need to be aware of, right? When you're looking at a digital business model, you quickly realize that it's not just marketing, which has been the play, for the last 20 years, perhaps. And it's not necessarily just dissemination either, which is what I'm about to talk about. But there's all this stuff in between about, sort of the back office and how we work and how we connect with buyers, and are there marketplaces, and what are the intentions of those marketplaces. All of these projects I've just talked about are essentially, they come from people who work in the arts. They are meant to not extract revenue out of the art sector into other sectors, but they all have cost structures, right? Whenever you do something in a digital world, you're really concerned about security. When there's a change in the operating system on your computer or your mobile device, guess what? All of that stuff has to be updated and upgraded. So there's a bunch of feeding of digital platforms that has to happen. So they do cost money. But when there is no profit motive of a serious kind attached to it, it does sort of shift the power much more so down the line towards the creators and producers, which is very much the intention there. So whether that is reducing the cost structures of showcasing, which is what the Pitch.ca largely is attempting, right? So it can actually reach a bigger market in the first place. And that market is still within the industry. It's other theaters, it's other presenters, it's other festivals, right? Or whether you're, trying to simply become more efficient in your back office. Maybe we can settle on one ticketing system, not three. As soon as you go digital, you'll discover, or sometimes, I've had clients that have PayPal, Square, and they also use another ticketing system, right? So very quickly that stuff proliferates for a bunch of reasons. One of the reasons is PayPal does really well with international stuff, but your other tools may not. So if you do festivals that attract lots of international companies, you may find that you actually need to use that because it's more effective than trying to, you're certainly not going to send a check, right? So those are some of those things that make you do things, but trying to figure out how to be more effective and not just proliferate tools, because every tool you use, you need training, you need people to know how to use it. There's a bunch of stuff that you do in terms of feeding them, right? All right. So dissemination, my favorite topic, as you know, is all about dissemination. So that's the more difficult play. Why is that more difficult? There is a ton of arts and culture content available in the world, completely for free. If you go to YouTube, what do you find, right? A lot of that is homemade. A lot of that is kids doing stuff or non-specialists doing stuff. It's video content that is sucking up valuable airspace for that otherwise might be consumed viewing professional or professionally produced art. And you can't, and users don't distinguish. They want to be entertained. Pretty simple, right? Sometimes they want more than that. News content, it has an incredible amount of, airspace, so to speak, digital space. It's not always frivolous content. It's not always just lowest common denominator, funny stuff. It's not just cat videos, right? The big players are YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, Instagram more so. And of course, Zoom became like a primary platform for many of us. They're an intermediary. They don't care about the content we're generating. They don't resell that content. They don't package that content. They don't work at all like YouTube, right? Those other services on top, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, tend to monetize through advertising. So everybody, so content providers provide content. Everybody who views that content is called an eyeball, just like it was in television, right? And that eyeball gets monetized by serving ads to them. It's how newspapers work too, right? Newspapers don't make their money on their content. They make their money on packaging the content so that advertisers have reasons to advertise in those pages. And that's where, the business model is at. Zoom doesn't do that. It's completely private. You've got your account. I've got my account. I put stuff on it. It's just an intermediary, more akin to your internet service provider. They're both subscription based, right? So when anybody in the arts tries to tell me how the subscription model is dead, I keep pointing to all of these subscriptions that you pay for every month, or maybe once a year, such as a Zoom or a Dropbox, or if you're using Google Drive and you have a lot of storage needs, right? You end up paying all kinds of subscription fees for that. The value proposition around that seems to make sense to us digitally. And then we just have to figure out the value proposition in the arts to actually make sense. Because clearly subscription is not dead. Most of your software is today consumed via subscription. You don't buy the Microsoft Office suite outright. You don't hard install it, in fact, on your computer necessarily. You use it in the cloud, and it's a subscription, right? This is important to understand a little bit about, different ways of making money in this digital space, where, when you use your content and you need to generate revenue from your content, there's different ways to do that. The way that we're used to in the arts is we sell a ticket or a subscription. That's it, right? Even Patreon is basically a subscription service, right? I have $5 coming out of my account every month to send to you because I like what you do. And sometimes you give me something in return. You might do a podcast or something. It could be like adjacent to the core of your business, or it could be the show. The problem that you run into with the YouTubes and Facebooks is that it's actually incredibly difficult for content creators, content makers, or producers to generate any revenue of those platforms. Those platforms are predicated to generate revenue for themselves through advertising. So there is a revenue sharing model, but the threshold for the number of subscribers and the views you must actually achieve is really, really high. And most folks in this world are kind of in niche art forms, doing niche things. So it's incredibly difficult to aggregate that kind of usership. So you don't really stand a chance, right? Now, you may have reasons to use them, right? Like because it's free to get on. And if you're more concerned about access to a thing, or you're using these to market a thing, right? Free access is very appealing. And what Facebook allows you to do to target your marketing, right, to a universe is pretty powerful. There isn't really another medium that does it as well. It's better than the community newspapers, which are very, very targeted, which are very niche. But be aware that if you start to use those tools to show the actual content, the art, right, you're now just giving them free content for them to make money off. Very difficult. And you'll have discovered that it's really hard to convert people to pay you money for your content, especially in those platforms, because all of that adjacent content that's sitting there is just a search away or a newsfeed away. I can be perfectly entertained and go down that rabbit hole and disappear for a couple of hours, right? There's no barrier to that. It's not a captive space for you. So in that world, there's a few Canadian initiatives that are trying really hard to provide an alternative. The first two, SiteDoor and Public Place Network, they work a little bit differently, but they're both predicated on making sure that when there is content, that the benefit of that content being viewable goes back to the artists and the producers, not the platform. So these are, as you may know, SiteDoor is a creation of Dan Mangan is involved in that, a musician, and Laura Smith, who's been an arts administrator for a long time. Public Place Network was started by a filmmaker out in Alberta, who got basically tired of, all these other platforms, making more money off his films than he was able to. So the balance is in the wrong place, right? So the intentions are the same behind these tools, which is to make sure that we shift the balance towards the earlier parts of the process of generating art that is viewable by audiences, which means, creators, makers, producers. When you use SiteDoor, there's no barrier to entry whatsoever. You just create an account, you can put up stuff, and only when you generate a transaction is there a cost, meaning they take a cut, right? And that cut is quite low. And it's really just meant to, provide the basic infrastructure of the site. Now, my own feeling is that they have to increase their rates a little bit in order to actually become sustainable, but they'll figure that out. All to say, it's a scenario where if you do an event, after settlement, you might get anywhere between 75 and 85% of that revenue you generated actually comes to you. So this is after the credit card fees, after some basic fee for the platform, right? That's a lot. In all of these media, I want to be really clear on this. In all of these media, the marketing is up to you. There is a bit of a faulty notion that says, oh, YouTube has $1.5 billion users, Facebook does too, and that somehow that audience is your audience. It's not, unless you market. So if you're going to market anyways, would you prefer to market your thing on platforms where you can actually benefit from that? Or do you prefer to market on platforms where you don't really stand a chance, right? That's one of the decision points you gotta understand. So my supposition is I prefer to have my show on SiteDoor than on YouTube or Facebook Live. It's new. They're not going to promise you the world in terms of accessing their audience, right? It's your audience you're building. And yes, you'll be on the site, so I can find you in a random search as a user just as well, right? That's all there. But I want to be really clear, right? That all of these platforms are predicated on you do your own marketing, like you've always had to. I've seen way too many arts organizations putting stuff on Facebook only to generate 10 views, right? Like, does it do anything for anybody? I don't know. Maybe it does. If those were like 10 impactful, viewers that you really made a difference in life, yeah, that's cool. I'm all for it. Maybe your audience was really just 10, and if you reached all of them, all the power to you. I think most often our expectation is different than that. Right, our expectation is, for far higher viewership than we're actually able to generate. And I think the difference is that we're not marketing these things. We're putting up content without marketing. We're feeding, those other engines. Does that make sense so far? Like in terms of what I'm trying to get at here? So SiteDoor is great for your live events. They built a partnership with Zoom through COVID. They have they have a broadcast level account with Zoom, not something that most of us would ever have a reason to have on our own. It gives them a little bit more capacity. They can run stuff for you. They have 150 trained people that can actually be hosts in those events that have dealt with all the nitty gritty of the technical issues your viewers will have, which no matter what they have, right? So a lot of things that really make it difficult for us as small arts organizations to produce live events well, they've taken care of as long as you use Zoom, basically, right? And it's an opt-in thing. So if you use the service, there's an incremental additional cost that gets taken out at the end of when you do your settlements, basically. So very low barrier to entry. Public Place Network is much better at distributing your video content after the fact. So you can stream on Public Place Network, but it's really not, it wasn't really ever its intention. Did I mention a filmmaker started it, right? It's basically you have a fully formed asset. It's a video asset. And you can, generate versions of that video asset. Like imagine you have a full concert, if it was music, you can unbundle that into individual songs, just like iTunes did with CDs, right? And you can actually generate revenue of the individual song. I don't have to sit there for a 2-hour concert, for instance. We know how that's much more challenging online, right? So that's what they're really good at. Now, initially, Doug Berquist, who started this, had a really high price of entry. And during the COVID period, he's been generating easier and easier points of entry. The problem that many are facing still today is that you still got to give them some money to be on the platform, just to be on the platform. So that basically has generated a scenario where he's got a really cool platform that can do anything you want. It's fully customizable. You can literally build your own business on top of that, look like you, feel like you, all of that cool stuff. But there is a barrier to entry. And it comes in a dollar amount. And that dollar amount has made a lot of people be incredibly hesitant. And the hesitancy, I think, comes from trying to balance I just need my stuff to be accessible, right, in the world for a bunch of mandate reasons. That actually is a perfectly fine thing. And I may have some things that I want to sell or that I want to figure out how to sell. But because the point of entry has been too high, not too many organizations are working that out. What I have been seeing is partnerships working it out. So he has a number of users that are basically aggregating content. The Manitoba Arts Network is one example of that. They're completely experimental. It's, you gotta try stuff out in this world, throw some mud at the wall and figure out what sticks, right? Manitoba Arts Network is a regional presenting network that has 50 members who are all rural in Manitoba. So there's two issues that those rural presenters run into, as you might imagine. And some of those you're running into as well. One is their internet capacity isn't that great, right? Their data throughput isn't that great because they're not living in sort of contemporary internet world. And that's actually a barrier to video transfer, basically. The other issue that they're running up against is to produce quality video is costly. So by aggregating content, you're able to have a more full channel. If you have 50 members, you're aggregating content for, if each of them produces one video a year, you have a vibrant channel. So the onus on the production side is to distribute it, right? As opposed to one little tiny place in ThePADE, Manitoba has to somehow create 50 videos a year. Very unlikely to happen, right? So it's when we aggregate, I think then the public place network becomes more powerful for us, as opposed to thinking, oh, I can do my thing, which is a festival once a year, and somehow make that meaningful in that framework. If there wasn't a sort of a cost element to it, I think we'd see a lot more proliferation of a whole bunch of little things. We're not seeing that, basically. What we're seeing is sort of a medium size of relatively consistent creation of content and being able to feed that. And one of the things that's interesting about the public place network is they give you lots of options to monetize. You can, in fact, generate, have advertisers, on your channel, just on your channel. You choose who's there, you charge them whatever it is, and you maintain and own those relationships. So advertising monetization, is available on that. It's a way to recognize your regular funders, right? Like there's a little banner, it rotates, you can give them that space that they might want. So that's actually possible within that framework. Other things that are possible within that framework is that you can, imagine you've started a channel and you become like the channel owner, and you allow other people to, place their content on your channel. You could actually charge people money for that because you own the thing, literally, right? So the framework is much more like, now you become like the television channel for puppetry in this digital realm. And you could decide that you own that. And you could decide that you're galvanizing your community around that channel. And, so what you're doing in that scenario is you're distributing your upfront cost over a number of players over a period of time. So riskier for you as a single organization still, but more palatable perhaps if you can build that kind of partnership. Or you go straight partnership, right? You say, no, it's all of us together from the start. Yes, there'll be entryways in over time. It's not a closed system we're building, but we want to all pitch in to start with, and we all have that stake to start with. And no, I'm not in a marketing scenario to my colleagues. We're in a marketing scenario only to the market, right? And I think that has a lot of appeal, right? Where you're able to say, let's aggregate. We each can do some cool stuff some of the time, not all of the time. And then what you're able to do is you're able to say, okay, so now subscription makes sense, right? And within the Public Place network, there is an option to monetize via subscription. There's options to monetize via, one-off sales, like a pay-per-view type approach. Very incremental, can be $1 to view a 2-hour thing, can be whatever you want. You set your prices, right? You figure out where the thresholds are for the kind of market you've got. This one of the reasons why you don't use your own website to house your own video content and then market it to the public in extensive ways is because you don't usually have the right capacity for that number of data hits on your own site. So they end up crashing, or the videos become chuggy, or there's all kinds of quality issues, or they become low res, depending on your setup. They just get, reduced like crazy, right? So usually you need somebody who, like a YouTube or a Facebook or a Public Place network, that uses basically a global internet infrastructure that has a ton of redundancy attached to it. So you can have the right quality video reliably being played back, right? So that's one of the reasons why you're not going to build a destination website if you're doing a lot of video content. You use it some of the time, and you can't afford the spikes. The data spikes is what kills you. If they were consistent, you just optimize towards that, and you have reason to buy that incrementally more expensive, hosting package, basically. But for most of us, that's simply not an option. And that incremental cost, hits you pretty hard over time. Yeah, if anybody's ever explored that, you'll realize quickly that data is actually expensive. In all of these frameworks, that's a completely hidden cost to you. You don't have to worry about it. They simply scale. And that's part of, why I think Doug has chosen to have a point of entry that has a dollar amount attached to it from the start. It's because there's real costs to run the thing. Whether he's explained that real well, I'm not sure. All to say, right now, today, it's still sort of the only spot like it that gives Canadian content owners an avenue to try to build a bona fide digital business that is predicated on dissemination, I should say. Like, this is all about the dissemination side, right? So to me, this is still, an interesting conversation to have. Maybe not the only conversation to have, but I think worthwhile for folks that are part of this conversation to really figure out, can we partner in the kind of way where this kind of thing starts to make sense? Because I think, Eileen, I know you've looked at that before, and it's like, it doesn't make sense as an individual organization. It's too prohibitive. And even though, there's now like $30 price points to start to get in, but what you get for that isn't enough, in my view. Isn't quite enough, right? Is it enough to try it out? I'm not sure that that's the right mud to throw at a wall. But I think Doug keeps evolving, and he keeps trying to make stuff happen, and he keeps growing. So while it's slower than I would have hoped, it is real. So I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have. Similarly to, back to ThePitch.ca. One of the uses that we're discovering, even in the early beta, because it's about access to market, and because it's predicated on video, and we know that good video is hard to generate. The Pitch has done a fair amount of work to try to figure out how to help people do video well. So one of the ways that has happened is there's like 3 or 4 different partners of sorts now, who basically put on a bunch of shows. One of them is Music from the Edges, 24 shows. So 24 artists all of a sudden had to be generating digital materials. as a show, like a bona fide performance. Well, when you do that, you realize quickly, and for the pitch, it has to be live performance. We do not accept music videos. You're pitching performance, right? So you got to give me performance video, not really cool, post-production stuff. So that project has basically generated pitch materials that are suited for the pitch at the same time. So you realize quickly that one of the costs in video production is the camera setup, the camera people, and the editing that goes into these events. So when you have that set up already, the incremental additional hour or two that it takes to then recut some of that to work with the pitch is actually quite a minimal investment. And this was based on factor funding. Homeroots has done a similar thing. They're decided to become a hybrid. They're my one client that is trying to really figure out how to be a hybrid organization. They know it's going to be hard, but part of the decision for them was that they're going to do a lot more work to lift up artists. And one of the ways that they can lift up artists is to equip them better to move from house concert circuit into the next level, which really is the regional presenter networks and the showcasing thing. Well, they can use the pitch, right? And they're taking out a lot of the costs associated to physical showcasing, including the curation and being curated out, not just curated in, and have a lot more market access. So they're also, because they're doing digital concerts, they're able from the start to now shoot 15 artists from the beginning with the intention to recut some of that so that those artists can have profiles on the pitch and populate that with really great materials. So that wasn't an intended use for us. But it's really cool to see some of those presenting organizations or intermediate organizations take it on and say, hey, I've got video. It's a small step now to be able to play, right? You're putting on festivals. Is that worthy to consider, right? Sometimes many organizations have been doing archival recordings for years and years and years, and they've just been using them as an archive. How big a step is it to create more than an archive? Where you have a single camera front shot kind of a thing. Maybe now you need 2 cameras. Maybe you need a little bit more of an editing suite. Maybe if you can have 4 cameras, that's awesome. Or right, so now you have like a full-on TV production. And that level of quality is going to shine, obviously, right? But if you're doing that already, right, how big a step is it to look at repurposing some of that footage and creating it for artists, for the sort of buyers meeting sellers marketplace interaction, right? And elevating the art form while you're at it, right? Because we know that puppetry is pretty niche, hard to get into major theaters. There is no intrinsic reason for that other than it's niche. But I think from an artistic standpoint, there's no reason for that. I would propose. Great theater is great theater by any other name. So that's the discussion that I wanted to put in front of you today, basically, is to say, here is, and I think part of that is, the business model side is difficult, in part because if you're trying to be both, we talked a little bit about that the last session, is your physical business model is demanding, and you've been working really hard to make that work. And it's always a little bit dodgy and a little bit precarious and a little bit stressful. When you're adding the digital layer, you need all of those same dimensions accounted for, right? And you do, but it's a new skill set. It's slightly different people, right? But you still need a stage manager in order to put on the piece that you can videotape, let alone if you're trying to get into VR, right? Or some of those other augmented reality applications, right? There's a lot of learning there. People in the world know that stuff. It's not like they don't exist. They're not people you typically had to work with. And you'll discover that they're more expensive than what you might be able to get away with in the traditional art sector, which, as you know, I think it was too low in the first place. But all to say, your cost structures really will change. And COVID support is going to run out around that. So a lot of people have been able to buy all kinds of camera systems and really been upgrading. sometimes your funders might have said, what's your training plan? So you have the things, but do you know how to use them? Right? So that's a real challenge, right? So when we're looking at that, we can't look at that just in the most facile of ways to say, oh, I'm just going to put my product up online. That's not really it, right? You need to actually create a digital experience, not just digitize the physical thing. If you see the nuance there, right? So we've talked a lot about, we've been skirting around that a lot in these conversations. And part of what your challenge lies in is to generate an audience for this digital experience. And we know already, you've known this because you all did some digital work in the last 2 years. You know that your audience is overlapped, but that digital audience overlaps to some degree with your physical audience, but it's also quite different. So the things you think you know about your audience aren't going to hold up as well in the digital realm, because you're seeing other people there and capturing who they are. It's not that hard, but you actually got to set up a system for it. Right? Making sure that viewers on YouTube, you have no idea who they are. Viewers on the Public Plays network, he's given you more options around actually, understanding that they're your customers, they're not YouTube customers, right? And yeah, I see a note here that taking a cut in fees. Yes, absolutely, he is the Public Plays network. That's one of the challenges. So I keep having conversations about that in my spare time to say, hey, how much easier can we make it to get in? And I don't know how far the budgeting can go on that. It's a lot cheaper than it used to be, and it's still a challenge, right? The intentions on the platform is that 75% or 75% of revenue should go to the content channel operator, to you. That's a lot more than what Facebook or YouTube ever will be able to do for you or care to do for you. But the upfront costs are not insignificant, right? So that's a real challenge. It's almost like you need to be more advanced than you want to be around figuring out your digital model, and that's super hard. It's super hard individually. But that's part of where I'm hoping that if we can have a conversation to try to figure that out. And working in a larger group, I think that's probably the key to it. I mean, right? I think that's your feeling at this point as well. Working in a larger group and distributing some of those costs a little bit better might well be the key to happiness there.
It would be interesting to see some of the membership organizations that exist for different companies to see if there's a way that they could take on some of that cost for their members in a way, since some of them have a larger pool of members. They might have some negotiating power with some of these more independent distributor networks. Yep. To see if that could be an interesting approach for different levels as well. Like PACT, for example, has a bunch of theater companies that are members, so they could have potentially approach and say, hey, we've got this many online shows this year, this many things, can we make a deal with you for that? And then that could give access to their members who are already paying a membership fee to them. So that could be some way potentially to start seeing if that could happen, because that makes, like you're saying, the larger scale makes it infinitely easier to negotiate, but also to actually cover the costs, right? Because there are costs.
There are costs, and they're real costs.
Yeah.
Right. So the platform cost is one cost, right? The video asset, is it worthwhile to watch this online, right? Piece is a whole other cost driver. And the skills that go into that kind of digital storytelling, as we know, right? They're a little bit different. They're just different enough to make it harder. So that's, I think that's the pitch. And I think that's essentially what the Manitoba Arts Network is trying to get at. They've created a channel for their members to use. And that could be workshops that they're running, like arts workshops. All these, their 50 members do a lot of visual arts, and they do a lot of training for the public, and some do professional training for professional artists too, right? So those workshops are actually worth something. And imagine being able to do the workshop once in one place, tape it, package it really well, and now you can actually put it on that channel, gate it as you need to. And it can be $1 or it can be $15 or it can be $30, doesn't really matter to me, right? You figure out where the thresholds are, but those workshops are a valuable asset. And here's my watercolor thing for 2 hours or whatever with instructor. And then if you get really sophisticated, you'll have a chat channel attached to that, right? Where I can actually ask questions and I create some real-time opportunities, even though the asset itself is canned, right? So you can sort of really try to play with that and make that experience actually worthwhile having. Similarly with shows, you know, we know that digital shows are more fun when it's not just a video that I'm watching as if it is television, because most of the time all I get is bad television. Right? But if I can interact, if I can engage, if I can talk back, if I, you know, if there's things for me as an audience member to, you know, to do and connect with my other viewers even, then I've got something. And it's beyond just the comments below a YouTube video, which are asynchronous as well, but it would be about a live, in the moment shared experience, right? And so figuring out when you're coming from the live arts, that is actually our interest. Right? It's not to make Netflix. Which, you know, if you want to do that, you know, get into filmmaking and try to figure that out. That's a whole other ball of wax, and not really core to what you're after. Am I missing something important in the chat?
Just the same capacity struggle as always to get these things to move forward. I think that's, we all are feeling that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, right? And I think in the music world, Factor has enabled some of that through some of their funding programs, where people are able to get money for digital concerts and recutting that using Factor money for the pitch. I'm not sure that you have an equivalent to that at all in the digital realm at this point. And I'm not sure what gymnastics we would need to do to figure out how to use some of the digital funding through Canada Council to enable some of that. There might be some ways to do that. If I'm not totally sure how they would regard that, because it gets really damn close to content creation, and that's where they have other funds to do that. But then it means that you're not getting those other funds to do your normal work, right? So that's a real challenge, where, you know, our funders universe has begun to catch up to reality, but it's still too narrowly focused, and the whole, like, I know here in the Yukon, they've tried to get our commercial sort of the economic development side of funders in sound to get away from demanding the CDs as an asset. Like, only if you had the CD were you eligible. It's like, who does CDs anymore? It's ridiculous. And a couple of folks have finally succeeded in convincing them to be able to generate pitch video assets and have funding for that. But it took a while, right? So those are real transitions that have to happen, and, you know, continuing to advocate is like a whole other ball of wax around advocacy that, right, you now sort of need to get your heads around to make sure that funding programs actually starting to catch up, and that somehow they're not miscuing you into all of a sudden your media arts or your digital arts or your inter arts. It's like, no, you're not, you're still the thing. It's just a medium you're using that keeps you in the contemporary world. But I think that's harder to understand, right? Yeah. Anyway, so that's, you know, that's sort of like this last layer of this business model, digital business model, and digital revenue streams. I'm keenly aware it's throwing mud at the wall. Like, I'm not going to try to pretend that this is somehow easy. It's not. But if we can figure out how to distribute the risk, that's part of what partnering gives you, right? And learn some of the things together so that we can each learn slices and get smart at that and share that knowledge. Maybe that's a much better approach. And I think that's very much what our work here together is predicated on, that type of, you know, mindset, right?
Yeah, thank you, Inga. If anyone, we still have a few minutes left, but I'll just mention, if you are currently watching the recording of this workshop, that all of the other previous workshops that have been referenced throughout this chat are all available to watch as well on the Springworks YouTube channel, as well as on the project page where you may be watching it right now, as well as all of the slides for all of the programs, all of the workshops, excuse me, both in French and English will be available as well. So please check those out. And thank you to Canada Council for supporting these workshops. We have a few more minutes. If anyone has any last questions or final thoughts or anything, please feel free to do so. But just figured I'd wrap up the recording portion.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Just to grab that moment to also discuss, if people are interested in having conversations, the next phase of this project that Springworks is supporting with our teammates is bringing people together for communities of practice, looking at beginning those conversations about how could we team up and share variants upon backside of the industry, front side of the industry, creation portions of the industry, dissemination of the industry. And this body is, a sector of it is puppetry, but another sector of it is multidisciplinary. And there is an intersection of new works in all of those, all of which are clearly niche. We're a set of niches that all intersect and would love to hold each other up as we hang on and try to proceed to find ways to make sustainability and versions of respect for our art forms, and obviously we all are passionate about believing it's their existent value. And so how do we help each other keep trucking along? Thanks bunch.
Awesome. And just a final word on full disclosure, I actually don't work at all with PPN. Even though I might sound like a pitch person, but I'm not. I do work with the pitch, and I do do a little bit of work on I Want to Showcase at this point as part of my client universe. But all the others are adjacent, interesting projects in the live performing arts that I think you need to know about to make better decisions moving forward. So just to make sure that you're aware of that. Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for your time. It's always good to see you.